welcome to Reinventing School. This is episode number 47, and it may be our most international episode yet. It also may turn out to be one of the most conflicted, perhaps a little controversial, as we look at homeschooling, alternatives to schooling, and the ideas that are beginning to take shape because we've had a year of unusual schooling, let's call it that, right? So this episode was very much inspired by my conversations that now go back 6-8 months with Gina Riley from Hunter College, who is in the interesting position of not only training teachers for the traditional school systems, but is also a leading voice and author in the homeschooling and unschooling traditions. So why don't we start there and just try to get a sense of where to put our feet. So Gina, welcome. Thank you for doing this. And I know you've corralled people from all over the world for this episode. So that's kind of great too. So kind of begin, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in education generally, and then what you're doing now and how the pieces fit together.
Sure. So hi, thanks for having us. My name is Dr. Gina Riley. I am the program leader of the Adolescent Special Education Program at CUNY Hunter College. Rasheen and Sam are actually my former students.
Say hello, each of you, so we know who you are. You're going to say something, so it will switch to you.
Hi there, I'm Sam.
I am Rasheen.
So I am started in this journey by actually homeschooling my own son. So he was 5 years old. I was a single mother. I was studying intrinsic motivation. I found intrinsic motivation super, super interesting. I loved what I was seeing in terms of the inherent curiosity my son was showing, in terms of like play, in terms of what he was learning just on his own. So kindergarten's not mandatory in New York State where I live. So I got away with not sending him to school for that 1 year. And the excuse was that, hey, kindergarten's not mandatory. We're just doing it for this 1 year. People were not happy. As a single parent, young single mother, that's okay. We're just going to do it for this 1 year. And then every single year, we chose, or he chose, to continue. And so his first day of school was his first day of college.
Slow down for a second. He chose? How does that work?
A question, right? Do you want to keep on doing this, or do you want to go to school?
But he's 6 years old. How does he know?
Yeah, I know. I mean, obviously it's like a dual conversation, but he was really a huge part of that conversation, right? What would you like to do next year? And, we had a conversation just like parents have with their kids. And every year the conversation went differently. At 11 years old, he was like, you know what, maybe. So let me see what's out there. And we explored some schools, and the answer was still, no, I think I'll just continue homeschooling. So every year was different. But we just continued and continued. You also have to understand that halfway through, so about 2007, my son was 10. Prior to that, I was an educational psychologist. Then I became an adjunct professor at CUNY Hunter College and later a professor. And I'm teaching teachers, New York City teachers, and I'm supervising New York City teachers. So I'm going around in classrooms and I'm watching and I'm learning and I'm loving. But I never did. I don't think any of my students will ever say that I ever mentioned homeschooling in any of their classes. I always come to homeschooling through the lens of intrinsic motivation. And really, we talk about intrinsic motivation, we won't talk about homeschooling. It's just, it doesn't serve my teachers well. And that's fine. I think they're two different realms, and I'm very into school choice. And so whether private school or charter schools or public schools is the best for your family, or homeschool, then I'm happy to talk and learn about it all.
Cool. Wow. Okay. We have a lot of stuff to talk about. Rebecca, you're coming to us all the way very early in the morning. Thank you. From Australia, from Queensland, right? So, and before we begin, I'm guessing a lot of people could sort of use a quick lesson. There are 6 states in Australia. Do I have that right? And Queensland's one of them, or am I completely off?
There's 7. I don't remember from my own primary school. So, this is one of the things that you learn. There's 2 territories. So each of the states and territories has a different rule about schooling in Australia. But we have a very strong private school tradition in Australia as well. So we had private schools when we were colonies before we were a federated country. So we have a very strong tradition of school choice in this country.
And tell me what you do.
I teach teachers as well. So I used to be a high school teacher. I taught in some of the toughest schools in cities around where I live. Students where you drive away and you'd be, oh, that's so-and-so's house. I know, because they don't have a front door, or there's a toilet and a bath in the front yard, that kind of thing. Very tough schools. And then I became a teacher educator in about 2007, I think, was when I started at QUT, and I've been teaching teachers longer now than I was a teacher.
So, of course, the obvious question is, did you wander into the wrong room? What are you doing here in a homeschooling conversation?
Well, I also am very interested in homeschooling. It's my main research area. It's what I'm probably best known for. And I do homeschool my own children. I have 3 children.
How old?
I have an almost 10-year-old, she'll be 10 in a fortnight. I have a 7.5-year-old, and I have a 4-year-old who's been up vomiting all night.
Oh, nice. Well, send our regards.
Thanks.
Hi. All right. And Cheryl, you're in a whole nother part of it, right? So you're in Georgia, in Athens, Georgia, you said, right?
That's right.
And let's hear the sort of combination story this is turning out to be, right?
So I also teach teachers. I'm an elementary teacher educator, and I'm at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. I also research homeschooling among African-American families in the US. And I've started an organization called the Black Family Home Educators and Scholars. And this is a place where we get together virtually. We're getting ready to have a teach-in. So I'm similar to Rebecca and Gina in that I'm in those 2 realms, as Gina said, that I teach teachers, but I also support home educators, Black home educators in particular. I became curious about what they do, why they do it, and I understand now completely, but it becomes part of my teaching at the university in terms of teaching about school choice, for example, in an issues and trends class. Teaching about family engagement, which is also part of my research. Family school partnerships is part of my research too. And so when we listen to the experiences of home educators who have had their children in public schools and made the decision to homeschool instead, it's interesting the way that those narratives corroborate much of what we hear is troubling in public schools, such as discipline, disproportionality, and lack of access to gifted education, marginalization of Black parents. And so I became intrigued because this becomes, it humanizes the statistics that we hear. How do Black parents experience discipline disproportionality? What does it look like from a parent perspective? It just became curious about that.
Wind back a little bit. How'd you get started in this? How'd you get started career-wise, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I became a teacher. I'm from Connecticut originally, so I taught in Connecticut for many years. I taught in an urban district, I taught in a suburban district, and it was night and day in terms of the type of resources and also in terms of who was attending school. And I just became really curious about, what happened to Brown versus Board of Ed, what happened to the great equalizer that education was supposed to be, because, in one district, I'm looking for chalk. I have to go buy my own chalk. And then in another district, I'm told we have extra money in the budget, write a wish list of things that you want. And I don't get it. Just send that extra money up the road, they need it. So I pursued my PhD at Emory University here in Georgia. And it started out looking at the urban-suburban inequity, and it turned into Black family engagement, because I started working in classes where they were reading things where Black parents were perceived as not interested in their children's education. And I was alarmed that anybody would think that. And so I pursued my dissertation on Black family engagement. What does it mean to us? But when I became a professor, I wanted to replicate my study, but I found I couldn't, because the people that were in my dissertation were in their 40s and 50s, and they didn't know the younger parents that were in those same schools. But then somebody referred me to a 32-year-old woman who homeschooled her children, and she was Black. And I said, what? We homeschool? I had no clue. So I interviewed her, and long story short, I got a grant to do a 2-year study with 46 Black families who homeschool, mostly in the Atlanta area. And I was just fascinated by the work. I have to say, my public institution and I had to go through a period of time where I wrestled with whether to continue to pursue the work. But now I have come out on the other end of that, and I'm I really do nothing but research on Black homeschooling. There's so much to understand.
And there's a lot to talk about there, and in areas related, but I want to get a sense of, so Rasheen, you're in Turkey, you said, right? So we have somebody from Australia, some from Georgia, this is a lot of places. Are you connected to the United States? You were a student of Gina's at some point. It sounds like there's another country in the mix of there. So give us the beginning of this. Where'd you grow up, and how did we end up, how do you end up being part of the story?
Well, I grew up in New York. So, I went through the public school system. I still remember taking the SAT exam. I went to Stuyvesant High School, then to Barnard College.
So you were a smart kid.
Well, I tested high, and I couldn't figure out why everything was so difficult. I figured out at some point as a special education teacher, I have ADHD. So that's why nothing was going in while I was listening to all those amazing lectures. And I think at some point in college, after a lot of frustration, I figured out I just have to write a lot. I have to write everything in order to retain it. But that isn't a successful long-term strategy. So I was definitely frustrated with my educational experiences because I didn't know why I was struggling so much more than my peers once I went to Stuyvesant. So that stayed with me, and I think it really informed my own teaching style, because I realized that not everything, most of what I was saying wasn't going in, because we really intrinsically don't learn that way, right? So I'd say, from where I started as a student who was frustrated to now, I'm homeschooling / unschooling my son. I realized like almost nothing. I'm basically just like wah. What goes in, it's not what's going in, it's what's coming out, right? Students want to learn intrinsically. And the best thing I feel like I've seen with my own students and now with my son is that when we give them the space to learn what they want to learn, and we give them the time, and there's no bell at the end of 45 minutes, there's no rush, they actually want to learn. And so in between, what happened was I was also a single mom going into the New York City Teaching Fellows, and learning how to teach and work and be a mom. And then Gina flies in as this amazing voice of just the possibilities for students to learn when they have intrinsic motivation. So I tried to bring that into my classroom. I worked in a wonderful school in Jackson Heights, Queens, in self-contained and ICT environments. And I think at the, as I continued my teaching, I realized the more I step back, the better it is for my students. I think, public education has this amazing goal to teach everyone. But what happens is because we're trying to do so much, right? There are so many requirements to fulfill that at the end of the day, our curriculum has to be super calibrated to all the legal and procedural requirements. And then we lose what makes learning fun. We lose what is actually fun to learn. So I found that with my students who were students with disabilities, much of what I was teaching was irrelevant. And so there was a disconnect.
All right.
So I felt like at some point I just no longer felt that there was true meaning or purpose behind what I was being called on to teach. So after some soul searching, I left the DOE, I left the US, and I said, I am going to homeschool my son, and I'm going to work with other families that homeschool. And so, I've taught art and STEM and, whatever it is, but in small groups to students who are interested in learning those things. And I found that to be a really rich experience.
Phew. These stories are really rich and interesting and different from the stories that we've heard on many of the episodes. Sam, with that setup, tell us about you. How'd you get started? What do you do now?
Well, I think Rasheen and I were actually in the same cohort. I remember you and I having peer conversations in cohort 25. So represent.
Oh,
yes, it's nice to see you again too, all the way in Turkey. So I started off actually not wanting to be a teacher at all. I wanted to be an art historian, and I had.
And where are you at that point? Are you in New York or elsewhere?
I'm in New York right now.
And were you then?
I was then at the time as well. So I started interning at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I volunteered one night with the museum education department, and I loved it. And I just thought it was so fun to be able to work with kids and kind of share their interest in all of these fascinating art objects at the Met. So I started getting very interested in museum education, and I ended up interning at the Museum of Natural History in New York. I went to California and I interned with a couple of departments or a couple of museums there. And I realized that I actually really enjoyed the teaching aspect of it. So I applied for the New York City Teaching Fellows and became a special education teacher for elementary schools. And Gina was my advisor. And I remember our first conversation still to this day. Gina just had so much love and was really, has always been my cheerleader. I became a little frustrated, I think, as a special education teacher, especially a very eager one. I started feeling like my plate was getting a little too full in the New York City Department of Education. And I moved to Hawaii and I became a special education teacher in Hawaii. And boy, were those Department of Educations different. I felt like the Department of Education in Hawaii was a little bit more behind than the one in New York was. And even my position as a special education teacher was very different from what I was used to. In New York City, I was a resource room teacher, which is called a SETS teacher. So I would pull out small groups of students and work with them for 45 minutes a day. And then in Hawaii, I was a resource room teacher, but I had a group of students all day long. And I started my first month in Hawaii. I decided to take the 6th grade classroom, and it was a classroom that was filled with boys. We only had one girl in the room, and they were difficult. I remember most of my colleagues, when I would first meet them and tell them my position, they would say, "Oh, good luck." And I called Gina one day hysterically crying because I was like, I can't do it. It's really hard. And like what Rasheen was saying, trying to fit the curriculum into these students that have not had positive educational experiences for most of their lives was very hard. And Gina told me, I remember she told me, do what you think is right for them. If your administration is not, watching over you, do what's best for them. You know them at this point, work with what's best for them. And I did that. And everything changed. There was such a huge shift in my classroom, and these boys that, were really dreading coming to school every day started to find joy in coming to school, because I started listening to their needs and to their interests, and trying to make our lessons about what they were interested in, while still trying to keep a little bit of the curriculum and some of our parameters of the curriculum. But then I left Hawaii and I decided to get a master's in social justice, because I was looking at the education system quite critically, and I wanted to learn why the education system is the way that it is. And I think, so much of what you were saying, Cheryl, was what I was noticing. And I wanted to learn about the history of that and how we can fix that. So I'm excited about this conversation, because I think this is what teachers talk about all the time, trying to improve the system. And, for us to be able to have this conversation today, and Howard, for you to give us a platform to talk about this, is great, because I feel like a lot of these conversations never leave the staff lunchroom or, our happy hour or.
So Sam, let me ask you a question. What's the connection to homeschooling then?
My connection to homeschooling. So I started when I was getting my master's, I wanted to work with students, but not as a teacher, just as something part-time. So I became a tutor, and I became a tutor about a month before the pandemic started. And once the pandemic started, the girl that I was tutoring, her mother asked if I could work with her online, because we could no longer meet in person. And she and I started working together about 3 hours a day, like 6 days a week. She and I really enjoyed working together. And I always used a lot of the methods that are in the foundations of unschooling. I would ask her every day, what do you want to learn about? What are you interested in? And I would just kind of find the resources to share with her, but she guided every lesson. And I didn't realize it at the time. But once I started reading Gina's work, after she published her first book, I read it and I was like, oh, this is what I do. And I still work with this student. In fact, I actually work with multiple girls. I at this point, I only work with girls. And I try to incorporate intrinsic motivation and self-directed learning into what we do online. So I really let them guide everything. And we've been able to have some really great experiences. We've been able to talk with authors of the books that they love. We've had a conversation with a New York Times bestselling author online, which was great. So I think, I'm kind of not an unschooling teacher per se, but I'm trying to find the bridge between something that is a bit more traditional and what our conversation is about.
Thank you. So Rebecca, this seems like a global thing. It seems as though we're all talking about curriculum in the same ways. We're all talking about the importance of intrinsic motivation and student decisions in the same way. And there's a balance of private versus number of public schools, number of private schools, the number of people who are in them. But how is it? Well, first of all, how much does this ring true for you in Australia? And then if you're comfortable, more broadly, is there something going on here globally that sort of, I mean, because we've got like 2 billion kids around the world who are in public schools mostly, right? 1.8 billion, something like that. And yet you guys are not the only ones who I've spoken to about, yeah, I don't know about this public school thing and the way we do it. It's like, could we be that off? So can you give me a little bit of a local perspective, a little bit of a global perspective, and then kind of what you're hearing and how you're processing this?
My first thought about this conversation is one, how similar all of us are in terms of the experiences we've had as teachers. So, all of us seem to have taught with students for whom school was not really working. I think the Australian context in terms of home education is a little different, maybe to the US context. I think we have a bit more in common, maybe with the UK and maybe with New Zealand, in the sense that most of our home educators don't do it for religious reasons. In my work, I've looked at what I call the accidental home educator, and I think that makes up at least 80% of the Australian, UK, and probably New Zealand home education cohort. So there are people who probably initially sent their children to a public school. We call them state schools in Australia. And then it didn't work. And often they'll try other schools and they find that the problem actually isn't state schools. The problem is school and the mismatch with their child. So they'll choose home education after that. So I don't think that most of the home educators in Australia have a deep and abiding passion for home education as a choice. They fall into it and then find a deep and abiding passion when it works for their child. So in my home ed group, there are Indigenous home educators, there's a kid with Down syndrome, there's a lot of children who are on the spectrum, and those kind of students don't really work in mainstream school. The other point I think is super interesting is this idea that school is meant to, raise all the boats. I do a lot of history of school stuff, and I don't think that's why schools started. I don't think schools ever set out to raise all the boats. I think schools had two purposes. The first one was a warehouse for children when parents were working and it was no longer legal to send your kids to work. And I think the second thing was that industry needed reasonably competent readers and people who are reasonably competent in numeracy. So that's really why school started. And then it's become this kind of place where we dump all of the world's problems. And we have a very crowded curriculum in Australia too, and we're about to do a big review of our curriculum. And we have a very right-wing government at the moment, and they're looking to take all of the really warm and fuzzy stuff out. Australia's engaging with Asia, Indigenous perspectives. They want to take those things out of the curriculum and basically teach a white canon here again. Yeah.
Okay, Cheryl, perspective here, please. And let me add a question. In addition to the desire for perspective, you mentioned that you work in the Black community. Are there parallels in the Latin community? Are there parallels in the Asian community, which of course will be quite different? And if you know it, are there parallels in the Indigenous population? Like, so how does this sit? How does what you do sit within the larger universe? But if you want to address some of the other points we've been talking about, please do.
Wow.
Yeah. Nobody ever accused me of asking simple questions.
Oh my goodness. I would say there's definitely parallels across different groups. But I'm one who's really interested in the diversity within a group. So even if you take Black homeschoolers in the US, they're all so different. Lately, in the past 5 years, I'd say, I'm seeing more and more secular Black home educators than religious-based. There are, depending on the laws, because in the US, every state has different homeschooling laws, and some laws, I believe, make it more challenging for a single parent to homeschool, for example. But here in Georgia, our laws are rather open, I guess, for home educators. And so we can hire, for example, in our state, a home educator can hire someone to tutor their child, even though they're homeschooling, so that person can then go to work, so that's okay. But that's not okay in every single state. So that's an issue. But I'd say when I look at why Black families homeschool, some of the parallels are definitely the fact that our schools have become more test focused, standard focused than child focused. And that's a constructive criticism of what I even see when I go in to supervise my students in a classroom or to talk to them about what they're seeing in school. And I'm trying to get them to focus on the kids and not the standards. And that's a tension that we have as teacher educators even. But I've had parents, for example, bring so like Rebecca said, the accidental home educator, they're sending their child to school because they themselves went to school and this is what we do. But when they show up, and they find out that kindergarten is all pencil and paperwork and very little play, learn through play, this is not what I want for my child. So that's where we, I think, align ourselves in terms of a cross group, that there are common issues with the way we do school, the pedagogical approaches that schools have taken on. And I don't think it's because of teachers, it's people who have been politically in charge and they think this is the way to do school. We need to let teachers be the professionals that they need to be, and we'll see a difference. But I always have to tell my students, you need to close your door and do what's best for the students that you have.
So here's what's deeply concerning about this. I'm watching because I'm seeing all five faces, right? And everybody's going, yes, everybody's agreeing. I don't want to see everybody agree that play is not part of kindergarten. Mm-hmm. Like that. I mean, I don't want to know that that's happening, where Rasheen is and where Rebecca is. How did we manage to spread these not such great ideas to so many different places so successfully? Mm-hmm. Rebecca, Rasheen, you want to pick up on that?
I would love to. We have this big standardized test in Australia in years 3, 5, 7, and 9, and we took it from the New York Department of Education. Our then Education Minister, Julia Gillard, who became our Prime Minister, went to New York and fell in love with it. And we call it the NAPLAN test here. It's the National Assessment Plan, Literacy and Numeracy. It is supposed to test how schools are teaching, but it doesn't. And if you want to go to an elite private school or a competitive public school here, you have to show your NAPLAN scores, and they've got to be at whatever percentage above the mean to get into these schools, as well as sit a test. So it's a universal phenomenon, and I think that the US has a lot to offer the world, and they have offered it to us, and we have greedily yummed it up down here.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Gina, what's going on here?
I'm pained. We know, teachers always know, as Sam said, right? Teachers always know what's best for kids. Everyone knows what's going on, right? They know the benefits of intrinsically motivated learning. They know the benefits of play. They know the benefits of self-determination. My work has always wanted to create that bridge, right, between public school, because we know kids have to go to public school, and public school is an amazing institution, and homeschooling and unschooling. And sometimes it's a numbers game, right? It's a lot easier to talk about intrinsic motivation when you're talking about 1 or 2 or 6 kids. It's a lot harder to utilize intrinsic motivation in a class of 20 or 30. Same thing with, self-determination. Same thing with play. It's easier to watch 6 kids than it is to watch 30 play. And so we know what's going on. I think a lot of times I talk about like the magic. We know what's going right with homeschooling, and we know what is not going right in public schools. The assessment, as Cheryl says, you have to stick to this very, very tight curriculum, and you have to do all these things in 45 minutes. So we know it's just a matter of not, I don't know. I've talked about intrinsic motivation in education for 20 plus years now. I talk about it in schools. I talk about it in school districts. Everyone loves the idea. It's an amazing idea. And it just doesn't get picked up because it takes long and it takes a lot of support. And it's not as clean as the 45-minute period, tight curriculum, and giving students tests and assessments.
Let me offer a theory which you guys are welcome to take apart. So Facebook a couple of days ago, somewhat biological diagram of a woman's body, a bunch of call outs. Not government property, not government property, not government property, not government property. 75% of the K through 12 teachers in the United States are female. So, and getting paid less and all of the other things, right? So is this a male control thing where, don't worry, the female teachers will do what we say? Because that's kind of, because there's something here that is utter nonsense that we've managed to spread all through the country. Is this just another version of that? Or am I going too far out? You're all smiling at me, but nobody's answering.
I'll try.
Go ahead.
I think I never thought of that. However, I've been recently doing research on girlhood and space, and I've been focusing a lot on how educational spaces affect girls. So I am getting a bit more into gender, but what I do have to definitely say is I think a lot of the policies that are enacted, although I think what Rebecca just said might counter what I'm about to say, are created by white males. I think one of the reasons that even though we're all in such different places and we're seeing these similarities is because of globalization and because right now what is valued is a knowledge economy. So education is regarded as a form of an economic gain for each country. And I think that because, and I don't know how close the gender, masculinity is brought into this, but I think policymakers don't view education the way that teachers do. And because teaching is a female dominant profession, I also think that we do have a bit more of that nurturing and understanding, which might be a more feminine quality or characteristic. But I just think that the people who are making the policies that we then have to practice are so far removed from a classroom. So they don't know that we know what's best.
So is the solution to jump out and homeschool instead? It's like, yeah, I'm not doing that. We're just going to stop. Like, because it's tempting to build that bridge, but you're all shaking your head no, really vigorously too, which is fun. So it's fun to look at a whole bunch of people doing the same thing. Rebecca, what?
I think that actually the issue is neoliberal economic policy, which we've had since like I was a kid in the late 1970s.
You
So
might want to
of-
break that down for us. What do you mean?
Okay, so I do like school choice stuff, and I think that what I look at is how we come to make choices. So since the 1970s, governments have pulled back funding from schools and encouraged parents to be what we would call responsible for their own children. So your child becomes a project of you, not the state. And your child's success and failure becomes a project of you, not the state.
That's good, right?
Well, yes and no. I come from Australia has a very different political history to America, and we have private, like public health here, where if my kid breaks his leg, it doesn't matter how much I earn. I take him to the hospital, he gets fixed for free, right? That's part of the Australian thing. We're very kind of European. I think partly too, though, when we pull back funding from public schools, but we tell parents that they have lots of choices, then sort of two things happen. One, public schools become incredibly underfunded, and that was certainly my experience of teaching in public school, although I taught in a very povo Catholic school too, so it's not uniquely a public school thing. I think along with that is the issue that if we're taking money away, we need to streamline how we do it. And you streamline by nationalizing the curriculum so that the kid in Billawheeler, a town of maybe 4,000 people, and a kid in Sydney, a town of, I don't know, how many million live in Sydney? 9 million, say. They are doing supposedly exactly the same thing at exactly the same time and being assessed in exactly the same way. And I mean, America's no less rural and remote than Australia. It doesn't work like that. Like Brisbane, with a population of 4 million, we're really different from Sydney. We don't really like Sydney. Sydney's kind of the you know, they think they're all London, but they're not. They're just in Sydney, of Australia. And you can't really work that way, but that's the cheapest way to run a school system. I think the other thing is, sort of going along with that, people are encouraged to choose. So they have. And there's an aspirational element to being a plumber who sends your kid to this private school that tells you that it's got this tradition, and we do music and we do equestrianism and we do all these other, and we do archery at our school. So they must be bougie, right? Because they do all these things, even though they're not very bougie, but it's quite cheap because the government funds most of the fees. And then maybe that doesn't work. So you wind up homeschooling because it is legal here to do that.
So Rasheen, you've got a few different perspectives here, and I'm making an assumption that you actually know something about the public school or the school situation, traditional school situation in where you are, as well as in New York. Is that true, or did you scoot off and just do homeschooling? You're really not concerned about what's happening in the rest of Turkey?
Well, homeschooling is illegal in Turkey.
Oh, well, that adds another shade to it, doesn't it? Okay.
So I educate a lot of Turks about my my decision for my son and what I do for, you know, with families who have chosen this path. I work with families in Canada, the US, and Malaysia. So my perspective is I have not set foot in a school in Turkey. And I just, I speak to people about why. And what it sometimes comes down to is really educating them about the disappointments that we encounter in schools, wherever you are. And I think that's a theme that we're all kind of touching upon, is we have resources, but we also have these requirements that make it impossible for us to truly give valuable education to students. And so when someone asked me, what happens with the child that's pulled out of school, and they can't afford to have different project boxes that are delivered to their houses, so that they could do like a Kiwi Crate or, learn in all these ways. And I say it's about access. If we are educating our kids at home, we do need access to certain resources. We need to be able to access books, whether it's through, online libraries or, just being able to walk in nature. So I would never say pull your child out of school unless you have an actual viable option.
Right.
And so that's something that I've been blessed to be able to provide my son. And I think, what we end up noticing when we pull our kids out is that they become these incredibly motivated learners that are learning really sophisticated topics on their own. I've been surprised. Like I call Gina and I say, I can't believe my son is spending 5 hours. He's still learning how to make airplanes, but now he's spending like months learning how to make a certain type of airplane. And if anyone asks me whether it's in the US or Turkey or anywhere, I can say, like, how many amazing people, like, can you name that are well-rounded?
Yeah. Well, all right. So thank you.
Has well-rounded ever earned anyone any credibility anywhere? Anyone that does anything great masters something because they love it. So yeah,
right.
That's been a really big part of our conversations.
That's another shade of this. But before I want to go deeper into that, but I have a question for Cheryl. So to tell the truth, and your version of the truth may be sharper than mine. we essentially designed school districts to make sure that white people did better than black. I mean, that's what we did. And we destroyed neighborhoods, and we made sure that swimming pools were filled with cement so that people couldn't swim, like all of this crazy stuff, right? And in some parts of the United States, let's call it a third, at least, there's at least the sense that that ought to continue in some way. We haven't broken through. So when I talk to some smart economist, he says, yeah, all you really have to do is look at the zip code. Don't worry about the SAT scores, because that suggests the success rate and all that. If you take people out of that situation, or you create an alternative path, or you work really hard to work against the situation, in theory, you would get better results. But the system, the map, the redlining, all of this is set up in ways that just create all of these obstacles, lack of resources, all of that, right? So how reasonable is that perspective? And how does, oh no, we'll homeschool fit into that? Or does it? Is it an alternative to that awful treatment? Or am I overstating or misstating that awful treatment?
No, that's what I research. And that's when you look at the narratives of why. So this is where Black homeschooling would depart from any other group. It's unless they also experience racism in their schooling experiences.
We have a few other groups in the United States who you could say that about.
Well, yes, but when you look at those numbers, it's usually Black and Latino students that are disciplined really harshly, starting at pre-K. The research shows starting at pre-K, we expel students, and it's the same thing that white students are doing many times in school, but they don't get expelled. So because of that inequity in experience, and I think also we should look at,
when you say inequity, you mean racism, yes?
Well, yeah, racism, definitely, yes.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we have a polite term.
But there's also inequity in, like what Rebecca was talking about in terms of school choice. What my research has shown with Black home educators is not every segment of a school district has the same equity in terms of school choice options. They actually draw lines. And if you live above this line, then you can go to all these great schools. Now we're in the same district, but those people that are here, oh, you can't go there. Why? So we do things like that within a district so that people that I talked to in my first study, the 46 families, most of them resided in a place where their children would have gone to a assigned school that was predominantly Black and under-resourced compared to the same level of schooling, the same elementary schools that were in the northern part of the district. Completely, totally different schooling experience in the same district, depending on where you were.
So do you change that, or do you just pull your kids out and establish a new
Well,
thing?
How long do you wait? I mean, these parents will complain. They go and try to work with them. Can we do this? Can we do that? The school won't listen. They can't do this, that, the other. So, do you jeopardize your child's education? If you have access to homeschool and you believe that it's going to provide a more excellent educational experience for your child, then they're going to go for it. I mean, I wouldn't wait. I did not homeschool, but believe me, I didn't rely on the public schools my children attended to do all the teaching. I was also teaching what I thought the school didn't do. I made up for it in whatever ways I could, because I could see it, what they weren't
can
doing.
every family, I mean, can enough families do that? That's a big ask of parents who may be working more than one job, right?
Yeah.
Who may be facing neighborhood issues and similar, or family issues.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's necessarily more towards one group than another, but this is the reality in the United States is, we have an enormous population of people who are lower middle class, who are struggling to stay outside the homelessness range.
I wish, you know what I wish? I wish we would pay attention to the decades of research that tells us smaller class sizes are better. I wish we would look at how we fund public schools and make it more equitable, because in the US, we do it based on the property value. So if you're in one of these places that has
one second. Rebecca, I love the expression. Say something.
Yeah. It's, why would you do that? You're creating a already natural inequity in that. And that's
you do that because you want to do that. There is no other explanation for it. It was done intentionally. Rebecca, she's like losing her breath here. Tell us what you're thinking, please.
Yeah.
Because our schools are funded by we call it the socioeconomic status model. We have a postcode, not a zip code, same. So the more disadvantaged you are, you get more funding from the government for your schools. And there's top-up funding for percentage of Indigenous students, percentage of students who have special educational needs, all those kinds of things. And there's still masses of inequity in our schooling systems because more money goes to private schools than goes to public schools because of the way the funding structures work. So we do exactly the same thing, but it's even more insidious because it looks like it's fair, which is the Australian way.
Right. Okay. So if we know this is unfair, and the kids certainly know this is unfair because as soon as they visit another school, they're like, oh, we're not going to be in good shape, right? So, and we know that this is by intention. So here we are marching, saying Black Lives Matter and everything else. And yet we're really not addressing that. Nobody's even mentioning that issue. So if that's as big a problem as you're saying, and we really want large numbers of people to homeschool as an alternative, that's quite a big Band-Aid. So Gina, can you kind of give us a sense of the Band-Aid factor in this? Do we keep on just saying, well, I know that's a little wound over there, and we got a lot of wounds in our school system?
Listen, I have never, ever seen homeschooling as like the solution to all the world's problems or all the United States' education problems, because that's not what it is. I love Cheryl's wish list. I want to add to it, right? And the ask is really, you have all this research on homeschooling and unschooling and what might work in education, in larger numbers, right? You've got this research on intrinsic motivation, on self-determination, on smaller class sizes. We've all seen it. We all know it. And homeschooling is just like a little tiny sort of, part of this research. But no one pays attention to it because it's homeschooling, and there's a little stigma with regards to homeschooling because, of course, one-on-one learning is going to be wonderful because look at the parent-child relationship, and all these parents are of high socioeconomic status, which is so untrue. So you've got the homeschooling research, but you got all these stereotypes. And so what I'd really love to see districts all over the world really look at the research, right? Look at Cheryl's research, look at the research of why people homeschool, look at the research of why intrinsically motivated learning is amazing, look at the research of why small classroom sizes are needed, and actually apply the research. Listen, I'm always going to come from a space where teachers are heroes. Right? My teachers that I teach every day, they are heroes. Homeschooling is never the solution, but let's pay a little attention to it, right? Because there's some really great things going on there that we can apply to school districts internationally, if not all over the country.
Rasheen, do you know the name? I'll mispronounce it, the Turkish. Ziya, is it Selçuk?
No.
Okay. He's the Minister of Education in Turkey. If we could, because we'll make a few phone calls for you, you'll have a meeting with him next Tuesday. You're having lunch, in fact. He'll pick the place. I'm making this up. Tell me about the conversation. And you will not get in any trouble. I've already taken care of that.
Oh, no, I certainly, my friend was telling me about this incredible school that the daughter of the president has set up in Turkey, and you have to have like 3 years of prior excellent academic records to get in. And I rolled my eyes because those are just not good indicators of success, fulfillment, the things that make life, amazing and wonderful and rich. I've spoken to Gina about my dream of opening up a space where kids could just learn what they wanted to learn with supervision from adults who could facilitate. I believe it was.
Okay, but what are you going to tell the person? What are you going to tell this minister? You're sitting there and saying, all right, you got some time with me. What are the 3 key points?
That's a really good question.
I'll let you think about it for a second.
Yeah.
I'm going to run over to Rebecca for a second. And do you know the name Alan Tudge?
Tudge.
Tudge. Thank you. I
Yeah.
guess you do. Tell us who he is and what he does and what you're going to have. You're having lunch on Thursday. I set it up for Thursday. Couldn't get Tuesday for you. It's going to be Thursday. So what are you guys talking about? And who is he?
Alan Tudge is the federal education minister, but education in Australia is managed. He only really has power over universities and funding private schools. All the states and territories do their own management of private schools and state schools. Okay. So we have a distributed federalism, I think we call it in Australia, a very weird system. Old mate Tudge needs to really look at how we are doing education in this country. He knows it's inequitable, but I think that's that's not the.
All right, that's fine. So who are you meeting with then?
I would probably meet with a woman named Grace in
Queensland.
Grace,
I have her on Wikipedia here. It is Grace.
Yeah, Grace. What a name, right? I work with a volunteer group that tries to advocate for home educators in Queensland. I'm meeting with the department today, actually, in a couple of hours' time. We tried to meet with Grace. I wasn't there because I was teaching my literacy students. And they spent 45 minutes of the hour-long conversation with Grace, these 2 incredible women who I volunteer with, trying to explain to her that homeschooling doesn't happen at home and that therefore the COVID restrictions that still exist for large gatherings in Australia shouldn't apply to home educated students because they're just like schools. So I honestly think that Grace doesn't really care, bless her, about home education, even though there are 4,100 odd home educated students in Queensland, and the numbers jumped about 20% between 2019 and 2020. But I don't think, to be honest, there's much point in having these conversations with Grace or Alan Tudge, old mate, because I don't think that they are particularly motivated. They think there's about 26,000 home educators in the whole country. They think that's probably quite small and that really they're going to go away and do their own thing on the side. Most people don't home educate, so it's sort of a thing we can pretend doesn't happen here.
Okay. All right. So Richard Woods, now I'm pointing at Cheryl. Richard Woods not only is the state school superintendent in Georgia, he's also been a guest on the show. Okay. So we know him. And he was terrific. So you guys are having lunch. It's actually a week from Thursday. He's at it. It's busy. So what are you helping him to understand?
Wow. I guess one thing is I would want to ask him in what ways the current policies honor teachers as a profession. And we could discuss that. I would also definitely ask him about our ability to shift the focus from test scores to actually looking at each student, looking at our curriculum, and how do we honor the various cultures that are in our state. Right now, we're not doing a very good job of that. And there's a lot of literature that talks about how important a positive self-cultural identity is to students' success, people's success.
Now, so I think you're going to find a welcome audience. He was a school teacher for 25 years.
Okay, good.
So K-12 all over the place, right? So he has the background.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think he doesn't understand about homeschooling generally and your specific studies within homeschooling so we can change the conversation in the public arena?
Wow. Well, specifically from my work, I think one of the things that stands out the most is these factors that literally push parents, Black parents, out of public schools. They are particular problems in the South. So you take discipline disproportionality. A study came out from UPenn that showed the disproportionality rate is worse in Southern states than it is anywhere else. So we have issues to work on in terms of how we interpret and how we do discipline. If we could just take that and find time to talk to children instead of being so quick to throw them out of school or to throw them out of class. And I mean, if we could just take that one big, huge issue, that would be, there's many other issues, but I think
that's the big one.
From my work, that's a huge one. So,
Rasheen, what are you having for lunch?
Oh, Adana kebab for sure. I fell in love with Turkish food, and you have to have chai, which is tea.
Right.
So I think, Turkey tends to be, it's a very nationalistic country. I think as an American coming here and seeing like the various national days when people literally like roll down the Turkish flag from their windows, I feel like what I would communicate is what would be best for Turkey, right? And what is best is the best possible citizens you can produce. And the best citizen is the one who lives out their life purpose. And so talking about excellence, in a school, let's say, for example, my son went to a gifted and talented program, and then he was doing maybe 1 or 2 lessons of math a week. This is in kindergarten. If we're standardizing things to the point where education is watered down, are we producing the kinds of people who will be the best for their country? If we were to look at the Turkish, environment, because there is a sense that education creates like world-class citizens, but is it really? Or is it just creating frustration? Or is it creating a disconnect from the desire to learn? Yeah. And so when we pull them out of this watered down version of education and really empower them to learn and provide access, I think so many of us are talking about how there's money there. It's just being used in the least effective ways. Right? So if we say, well, this teacher can facilitate learning, let's give them the tools, then we get learners who are much more powerful in the long run than these versions of kids who don't want to go to school.
Yeah. Sam, thank you. Who do you want to have lunch with and where? So you have the whole world to work with.
The whole world.
I mean, how do you figure out who do I got to talk to change something around here, right?
Well, I don't know who I would want to have lunch with, but I do know what I would want to say.
There you go. Good. And if you want to address, the entire world from a luncheon platform, that's okay too.
I mean, I guess personally, I would love to have lunch with Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden, because she's one of us, and I would like to see what her vision is.
Okay.
But I with who I do have lunch with, I think right now we have a really unique opportunity to look at or to reframe the public school system as we're coming back from COVID. So many parents saw the struggles that teachers deal with. Homeschooling became the norm, that there was this computer screen, but students were mostly all over the world learning. Every student was learning from home at some point within the last year and a half. And I think that what I notice with the students that I work with is that partially due to social media and the rise of young people using social media. Young people are becoming so connected to a global community, and they're becoming really awakened to issues that are happening all over the world. And I think that as teachers, as educators, it's our job to nurture that curiosity. And I think that that's completely, tied to intrinsic motivation, and self-directed learning, to allow students to really choose what they want to learn about, because right now it's just becoming so easy. Students, what I realized when I was younger, I didn't care about the presidential election. Mind you, I didn't care about the presidential election of any other country either. And the students that I work with, they're in the UK, and they were so passionate about the United States presidential election.
Yeah.
So much so that I wrote my master's thesis about that, because that was what I thought was so interesting, that they really, not only do they care, but they take the time to learn about it. And, I don't water down my discussions with them. I can talk to them the way that I'm talking to you all, because they truly care about that. So I think taking some of that, finding a way to incorporate what we see, the trends that we see are happening with young people, and, opening our eyes to seeing what is important to them. And I think that also would contribute to what Rasheen said about becoming a good citizen. Becoming political is woke now. So it's something that, young people are interested in. And I think that's a really unique opportunity we have that, at least when I was younger, I don't think was there.
Yeah. So Gina, how much of, you are in we should explain that CUNY, correctly pronounced, would be the City University of New York, right? Because we mentioned that earlier, and we should clarify that. So you're in a fairly traditional State University of New York controls the City University of New York City, right? More or less. So it's part of a big public school system, one of the biggest public school systems in the country. And I would think by extension, one of the largest public school systems in the world, right? So there's got to be a machine of some sort, because it's just a lot of people going through this, right? And what we're talking about here are not new subjects. All of us have spoken about this. Now we're approaching 50 episodes. We are touching on the kinds of subjects we talked about today in every episode. And certainly the conversations, Gina, you and I have had, and that we've had with one another, everybody's sort of pointing in the same direction. So how much of the kind of discussion that we're having gets tagged to homeschooling, so it ends up being, let's put it over there? How much of it is, these are really important ideas that really need to define what teaching and learning and school look like for the middle of the 21st century. Well, actually, we've been doing the 20th, but let's assume for the moment we can actually do the 21st. Is there hope? And if there is, what are the indicators that we should be looking for?
You see hope, right? These are my beloved students on this call. So you see hope in Rasheen, and you see hope in Sam, and these are the individuals that are going to change the world as we know it. And never has homeschooling been mentioned in their education, right? But they do know the power of intrinsic motivation and the power of self-determined learning. They know what that looks like. They can see it, and so they can see it in others. One of the reasons why I teach teachers and why I love my job so much, and I feel like it's an honor always to teach teachers that go into the New York City school district, is that I have always felt in some way, right, if I can't change the world, right, if I can't be the Secretary of Education, perhaps I can change a cohort of students becoming teachers, to see the benefits of intrinsically motivated learning, to do that and to learn and grow with their students. And, that's how change happens, right? I get frustrated because change doesn't happen in a big way sometimes. Change has to happen with each individual person doing their part. The more and more people that do their part, then things change. And so my hope is always, right, like that my students feel the love that I have for them, that my make students feel and see the love that their students have for them, and that grows into more intrinsically motivated classrooms, right? And so I do my little tiny part, talk to school districts, talk to my students, and I'm hoping that becomes the reinvention of school, right? Because if ever there was a time to reinvent school, this is the time, right? And we'd be fooling ourselves if we just go back to the way things were.
On that note, thank you all very much. We're going to roll the credits, and then I'm hoping all of you will stay around for just a few minutes afterwards for me to thank you. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.